Welcome to Unlicensed Oral Arts, where we do storytelling and folklore, and today, something a little bit different. You can probably guess, seeing as I'm in a kitchen and wearing an apron, I'm going to be doing a bit of cooking. Because St. Patrick's Day is either tomorrow or today, depending on when I get this uploaded, and so I thought I would do some traditional Irish cooking. Now, Ireland isn't particularly known for our cuisine. We've got Irish stew, baked potatoes, mashed potatoes, potato cakes, a lot of potato, but also soda bread. Most countries, they will have their form of bread, their staple bread. Here in Ireland, our national bread is a quick bread called a soda bread. Called a soda bread because it is made with baking soda. And it is probably one of the fastest, easiest breads you'll ever make. Because the rising agency is baking soda, there's no yeast, so you don't have to prove it, you don't have to wait for it to rise. Also, it's made with just plain regular flour, not strong flour, so you don't need to knead it a lot to build up the gluten. It's really quick, really easy, and really delicious. So I'm going to make some. The recipe I'm using is it's from the Ballymaloe cookbook by Myrtle. This is quite an old cookbook. If you don't know, the Allens who run Ballymaloe, they're basically a clan of super cooks. I would always trust a recipe by one of the Allens. And this recipe book is probably as old as I am. Her soda bread recipe is really simple. Pound of flour, teaspoon of sugar, teaspoon of salt, teaspoon of baking soda, and 300 to 600 millilitres of buttermilk. The buttermilk is really important. Of course, there are other soda bread recipes out there, loads of them. Some of them use buttermilk, which is quite traditional. The buttermilk has the acidity, which then reacts with the baking soda and gives you the rise. But other recipes use live yogurt. Some use stout or beer. You can also just use regular milk and add a teaspoon of vinegar to give you the acidity. But I think the buttermilk is the nicest. It just gives the bread something extra. So I better start measuring out my ingredients. And my regular scales has broken, so I'm using a cheap backup scales. And I'm not used to it yet because I was making something yesterday and I was weighing that and thinking, this looks like a lot more than it should be. I was reading the wrong dial, so I was looking at kilos. So I just want a pound, and I've worked out which one is the pound. For those of you who don't use imperial measurements, I was brought up using imperial measurements and I haven't quite switched to the metric system yet. I'll be including translations of the measurements down below for grams and, if I can work them out, cups. Never quite got my head around cups. I know it makes more sense because it's all based on ratio, and particularly with baking, it's the ratios that are the important thing, and like different things have different weights. But I've just never quite got my head around it. I generally switch between imperial and metric. I was brought up on imperial, but then when I was at school, I was doing home ec. Everything was metric. Okay, almost a pound. There, a pound. A pound of flour. And as I said, for soda bread, you just use regular flour. Cake flour, you don't need the strong white flour, you don't need 00 or anything like that. You can also use wholemeal flour or other types, but I'm just using plain white flour. And into the bowl it goes. Then I need my teaspoon of, well, no, half a teaspoon of baking soda. Of salt and half a teaspoon of sugar. Sugar. Yeah, that's all the dry ingredients in the bowl. I'm just going to stir them around a bit with my trusty wooden spoon. The wooden spoon, a very traditional implement which will strike fear into the hearts of many. It's the traditional weapon wielded by the Irish mammy. It's a symbol of power. And I like it. You don't need to use one spoon. You can actually, in some recipes, they say just mix with your hand, but I like to use the spoon because it's less sticky. And then I'm going to weigh out my buttermilk. Buttermilk, it comes from when you were making butter from milk, obviously. You would take the leftover, after you'd made the butter, got the cream out, you'd take the leftover would be the buttermilk. And it's a bit more acidic, so it works quite well in this. Today, most commercial buttermilk, I don't think it actually comes from when they made the butter. I think it's deliberately made and cultured, but I like it. It's also kind of, I don't know if you can see it, it's sort of slightly thicker than regular. You know the difference when you pour it out. And I've measured out 600 millilitres, but the recipe says between 300 and 600, so I'm just going to add a bit, stir, add a bit more, see how it goes. So in it goes. Half of it, so that's about 300 millilitres. And this is where a 2-camera setup will come in useful. Can I stir on camera? No, I can't. Sorry, can't see it. So I'm stirring it together, it's coming together, forming a sort of loose dough. It needs a bit more liquid. I'm just making a plain soda bread, but you can make any type you like. You can make a wholemeal one. You can also add flavours to it, get really inventive. I think the Great British Bake Off, they did an episode where people made soda bread, and you can make it sweet by adding like dried fruit, chocolate, spices, honey, or you can go the savoury option, cheese, herbs, cooked meats, really anything you think of. So my dough has formed. There, isn't it lovely? And it's like a scone dough. It's it looks a bit lumpy. It's not the prettiest. And whereas most breads you would need work that gluten, get a lovely smooth finish, you don't do it with a soda bread. And also with the soda bread, you don't need a tin. You just bake it on a sheet. So I've put a silicone baking sheet on my tray because I can just shove this straight into the dishwasher. And while I love baking, I hate washing up. So down it goes. And you also don't need to do a lot of shaping with the soda bread. So I've just sort of dumped it onto my tray. I'm going to move it slightly more into the centre, make it slightly rounder. Yeah, and you can see it's really sticky. I'm just lightly touching it, it's already sticking all over my hands. And here is where sort of the folk magic comes into this bread. I need a knife. Soda breads, they vary in form. You can get like ones that are made in a tray, particularly if you're getting like a wholemeal brown soda loaf that you're going to serve smoked salmon on. That'll probably be cooked in a rectangular tray. But the traditional soda bread tends to be round, and it can either be flattened out and fried, or it can be left in sort of a dome shape and baked. I'm going to bake mine. I always bake my soda bread. But the important thing is, if you're baking a round soda bread, is you have to put a cross in it. Now, the reasons for putting the cross will vary depending on region. Some say it's to drive the devil out. Others say it's to keep the fairies away. Or the one that I heard was it's to let the fairies out. In case while you've been cooking it, some fairies drawn by the buttermilk, because we all know fairies love dairy products and especially buttermilk, that they might be drawn into the mixture and get trapped in there. You have to make your cross to let them out. It might also be because generally soda bread, rather than cutting it into slices like this, you sort of cut it a bit like a pizza, and you can divide it into 4 easy sections, and then you can wrap one up, take it off with you for your lunch. So the dough is finished. That is literally how simple it is. It's taken less than 10 minutes with me nattering away. So I've got my oven preheated to 180, and I'm going to pop this in. It should take about half an hour, 40 minutes, and I'm not going to keep recording all that time because that'll be incredibly boring. But when it's ready, I will come back to you. Yeah, that's what it's looking like. See, it's lovely and risen. It's been in about 10-15 minutes. So it's about halfway done. And you can see all those sort of crunkly bits on the top from where it wasn't smooth. They're going to be lovely and crispy and golden. Can't wait to eat it. So the bread is now ready. Ooh, no. So the bread is now cooked. It's out of the oven. It smells delicious, but I have to wait until it's cool before I can cut it. If you're making soda bread at home and you want to know if it's finished, turn it upside down and tap it, and it should sound hollow. Yeah, it should sound hollow. Same with if you're making brown bread. So now I just have to leave my bread to cool, and then I can cut a slice. I think I'm going to have it with loads of butter, and then we might sit down with a cup of tea, slice of soda bread, and I might tell a story. So the bread has cooled. I've sliced it. I've put some butter and jam on it. I've actually been munching away on it. It's really good. Fresh bread always tastes so good. Got raspberry jam and lashings of butter on my bread. It's just really, really tasty. This bread, you can put butter and jam on it like I have, sort of treat it like a giant scone, or you can have it on a side of soup. Probably wouldn't make a great sandwich, but it is a really good bread and it is really tasty. It won't be lasting much longer in this house. And of course, to go with the bread, I have a cup of tea. Can't go wrong with a good cup of tea. And now that I'm settled down with my tea and my fresh bread, it might be time for a story. Now, once upon a time, there was a widow. And this widow happened to live next to a young farmer. Now, this young farmer was kind and handsome, but most importantly, he had good land. He had good green fields, excellent grazing land. And the widow herself, well, she happened to have a few cows, and so it would have been a perfect match. She began to call on him, pay him visits. Whenever she baked a loaf of soda bread, she'd cut it in half, wrap it in a tea towel, and drop it over to him, saying that, well, she wasn't used to just baking for one, and since he was a man on his own, he might take kindly to the food. It would be a shame for it to go to waste. And the farmer always accepted her gifts and would invite her in for a cup of tea, and if it was a cold day, maybe something stronger to keep the chill off. And so this continued. And the widow became certain that her plan of seduction was working. They say that the way to a man's heart is through his stomach, and there is no love charm stronger than that of good bread. So imagine her surprise when one day people said that the farmer had wed. She thought this was nonsense. He must have been talking about getting married, about marrying her. But no, he brought home a bride, a blushing young bride, and the widow smiled and gritted her teeth. And when the farmer called over to her and asked if she'd give his wife a hand with keeping house, since this would be the first time she was doing such, the widow just smiled and nodded. But in her head she was thinking of all the loaves of bread she had baked, all the loads of washing she had taken in, all the months of smiles and glowing looks, all wasted. Now, she was not a woman to take this lying down. So she decided she would get her revenge, but revenge is a dish best served cold. I'm just going to take some more bread. She did as the farmer asked. She'd call over to his house, help give his wife instructions, answer her questions about the more complicated aspects of marriage. And she began to gain the young woman's trust. And so when she called over one day, and the wife was churning the butter, she asked if she might take a drop of the milk for herself. Drop of milk for her tea. Now, it's a dangerous thing to give someone your milk, the milk you're using for your butter. There can be charms played, but the young wife felt that she could trust the widow who had been so kind to her, so she gladly gave her some of the milk. The widow took it to her own home, and she poured it into a jug. That night, by moonlight, she crept to the graveyard, and by night she dug up a corpse. She dug the corpse and broke off its hand, which she took back to her own home. She used the fingers of the corpse to stir through the milk. She stirred and stirred, and as she stirred, she took all the goodness from that milk. No butter would be churned in that house. The next day she called over to see how the young wife was doing, and when the young woman was otherwise occupied, she sprinkled some of that milk she had stirred with the hand of the corpse around the hearth fire, around the doorway, and where the butter churn was. The next day, the young wife sat down and began to churn the butter, but though she churned and churned and churned, the butter just wasn't coming. When her husband came home, she was in dismay. There was no butter, and there was nothing worse than no butter for your bread. But the farmer said, well, it was probably something to do with the weather. The butter would come the next day. But the butter didn't come the next day. No matter how much the young wife churned and churned and churned, the butter just wouldn't come. And that wasn't the only thing going wrong in the house. The bread wouldn't rise. The eggs all seemed to go off as soon as they crossed the threshold. She was in dismay. She didn't know what to do. She kept called to the widow, asking for her help, and the widow smiled and said, oh, well, you're only a chick of a girl. You can't be expected to keep house. Take some of my butter. Take some of my bread. And the young wife, she felt ashamed that she couldn't keep the house in good order. But it continued. Nothing she tried seemed to work. She became truly desperate. And she called upon one of the cunning folk. Now, the cunning folk, they're the ones who know. They know which herbs cure and which ones kill. They can read the signs of the birds to tell the weather. And it's said that some of them even know some of the magic of the fairies. The young bride went to the cunning woman who lived near and begged her to come and see what was wrong with her house. The cunning woman came, and as soon as she crossed the threshold, she went, there is something in this house. There is a pishhoke. Tell me, young one, have you angered anyone? Did a mysterious old woman call to your door asking for a glass of water and you turned her away? Did you shoot at a hare and then the next day someone in the village had a limp? The young wife said, no, nothing like that had happened. She had no enemies that she could think of. But the cunning woman still felt that something was wrong. She walked about the house 3 times. She came and stopped by the butter churn and asked the young wife, had she lent anyone the milk that was to be churned for butter? The wife said, well, she had a while ago lent some to her friend, the widow, but the widow had always been so kind and generous with her. Well, the cunning woman knew. A friendly smile can hide many things. She went to the fire and she took the ash, still hot. She rubbed the ash around the door frame. She rubbed the ash in a circle around the butter churn and then took an iron horseshoe and placed it there. And from that day forth, the butter came. There were no more problems in the house, and it was said that that farmer's wife made the creamiest of butter. And the widow, well, no one knows exactly what happened to the widow. She wasn't seen for some time. And the farmer, who of course knew nothing of what had happened, began to feel a little bit concerned for his neighbour. So one day on his way home he decided he'd just pop over. He knocked on the door, but no one answered. He went round to the back and knocked again. Still, no one answered. He pushed his way in through the door. Well, there wasn't a sign of the widow in the house. But there on the table, sitting, waiting, wrapped in waxed paper, there was a lump of butter. So, just a little bit of story to go with your bread. Also, some of you may have noticed my hair is a bit shorter than it used to be in my last video. The reason is I cut off my hair, 23 inches of it, for Akidwa. Akidwa is a women's immigration charity here in Ireland who do a lot of work around FGM. I cut off my hair to raise awareness of FGM and also to provide funds for women who have undergone FGM to receive counselling. For those of you who don't know what FGM is, it stands for female genital mutilation. If you would like to learn more or learn what resources are available or how you could help prevent FGM, I've linked Akidwa's website down below. Hope you have a great St. Patrick's Day and may your bread always rise.